Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Psycho.com, Serial Killers on the Internet, by Eileen Ormsby, narrated by Romy Nordlinger. Introduction. Of all the criminals that walk the earth, none provoke such fear and loathing as the serial killer. Serial killers can't be reasoned or pleaded with, and one on the loose is the ultimate bogeyman. A news report of a serial killer roaming the streets stirs up fear and anxiety, even though the odds of us encountering one are tiny. Imagine, then, if such a monster could come off the streets into your lounge room via your computer. This new breed of serial killer may intrude on your life by way of a viral video, modern-day snuff, showing their crime in grisly detail with a gruesome soundtrack to match. Perhaps they search for their prey online, lurking behind desirable photographs and agreeable dating profiles, waiting for the perfect victim to match with them. Or imagine a dystopia where a serial killer pops up as a YouTube star, with a following and fan base that places him squarely in influencer territory. You will meet these exact psychopaths in this book. All three stretch the boundaries of what we think of as serial killers, as their crimes and motives don't accord to any of the popular tropes we are so used to seeing played out on TV. They may not be household names like Jack the Ripper, Ed Kemper, or Ted Bundy, but they provide a fascinating glimpse into a new breed of killer with a very modern hunting ground. Never in history have we had so much information on serial killers at our fingertips. Entering the name of even the most obscure killer into an online search engine will bring up a treasure trove of references, often a Wikipedia page, or perhaps an entry into Wiki's macabre cousin, Murderpedia. We can piece together a story from news clips and blogs freely available online. We can read about them in a book, many of which promise untold stories from victims who narrowly managed to escape, or provide insights from the killer's own family, friends, or colleagues. We can watch them in films or TV series, opting for the documentary or the dramatization of their lives as our mood dictates. Or we can listen to the tales of cruel tortures, peculiar rituals, and nightmarish victim ordeals while on our morning walk or doing the housework, thanks to the technology that delivers podcasts and audiobooks straight to our phone. Our fascination with serial killers is boundless. They tantalize us, even as they terrify us. Although the term serial killer has been around for less than 50 years, salacious interest in such beings is at least as old as Jack the Ripper, and probably even older. Serial killers have been identified as far back as ancient Roman times, hundreds of years BC. According to Professor Mike Amott, who has compiled the most complete database of serial killers in the English language, we reached peak serial killer in the 1980s, and there has been a clear downward trend in the number of serial killers we can identify since then. The steady decline since might be attributed to advances in forensics and policing techniques, or it could just be that the killers have become better at hiding their tracks and bodies. Maybe they are choosing victims who might not be missed by family and friends, or whose disappearances are unlikely to be linked to one another. Just as we have access to a myriad of information about serial killers, so too the modern-day serial killer has access to information their predecessors could only dream of. With the help of the Internet, they can study the most up-to-date methods law enforcement has for identifying and tracking them, learn from the mistakes of their predecessors, or take a masterclass in investigative techniques or DNA profiling. Indeed, one of the killers in this book did just that, meticulously documenting everything he knew and outlining his cunning plan to thwart any investigations. As it turns out, He failed miserably and is perhaps one of the least successful serial killers of the century, but his downfall came thanks to another internet phenomenon: people who are connected and communicate their every last movement to each other constantly. Online forums and chat rooms, e-commerce sites, social media platforms, and dating sites became the new hunting ground. Killers could target victims who meet their particular criteria by targeting the kinds of sites that demographic was likely to frequent. It was a chat room for gay men that served as the meeting place for the first known case of murder where the killer and victim met online. In January 1996, Chip Hemingway killed Jesse Unger after the two men got into an altercation over Unger's mistreatment of a 15-year-old boy. Hemingway shot Unger 3 times in the basement of his home while the boy watched. Afterwards, the killer again turned to the internet, this time to ask 2 friends to help him to dispose of his victim's body. Craigslist appears to have the dubious honor of being the most common starting point for many internet homicides, so much so that a Google search will bring up listicles of the most notorious so-called Craigslist killers. One Washington Post article from 2016 claimed that no fewer than 101 murders had been linked to Craigslist. Jack Levin, a Northeastern University criminologist, quoted in that article, said, "Traditionally, the majority of murders were committed by killers who knew their victims. Thanks to the internet generally, and Craigslist in particular, stranger homicides have been on the increase." The obvious place in Craigslist to find potential victims is in the personals section. Newlyweds Elliot and Miranda Barber lured 42-year-old Troy LaFerrera to his death with an ad promising a young girl's companionship in return for $100. When he arrived for the assignation, the teenaged Miranda told him she was only 16 and asked if he still wanted to go ahead. She claimed that she would have let him go had he done the right thing, but LaFerrera wanted to proceed with the transaction, so she stabbed him while her 22-year-old husband of 3 weeks hid in the back seat of the car. Miranda Balfour later claimed to be a serial killer targeting men who paid underage women for sex, but there was no evidence this was true. In 2009, 23-year-old medical student Philip Markoff attacked and robbed 3 women he met through their advertisements of erotic services. He murdered one of the women, Julissa Brisman, earning him the first known use of the term Craigslist killer in the press. In some circumstances, the killer would post a phony job advertisement to lure a person of a particular demographic to the murderer's house. Thus, in 2007, Michael John Anderson, posing as a woman, posted an ad looking for a babysitter in order to lure young women. He killed 24-year-old Catherine Ann Olson, who applied for the position. Richard Beasley, also known as Chaplain Rich, lured 3 men to their deaths using a Craigslist ad for a non-existent job in 2011. Chaplain Rich was a wanted man and needed at least one new identity, as well as cash to enable him to evade the authorities. He was able to word the advertisement to attract middle-aged white men similar to himself, and then ascertain they were not likely to be missed with a carefully worded questionnaire before he offered them the position. Hand in hand with the internet came the smartphone. With half the world's population walking around with a camera in their pocket, there is more chance than ever before of catching death and mayhem on film. Publishing it to the world takes a matter of seconds. This meant that deaths, both accidental and deliberate, were being digitally captured, bringing the long-held myth of snuff films closer than ever to becoming reality. Snuff films are difficult to categorize, but the generally accepted meaning seems to be murder on film for commercial gain. It's a bit like the Stewart's test for obscenity. You may not know how to define it, but you know it when you see it. However, despite the snuff film being a ubiquitous staple of popular culture, prior to this century, there had never been a single verified example of a snuff movie. It is one of those myths that people cling to ferociously, reasoning that humans are capable of all kinds of depravity. It could happen, so it must happen. The Internet plus phone combination meant that more deaths than ever before were caught on film and uploaded to an instant audience. Terrorists, particularly the Islamic State, began deliberately filming and circulating beheadings as warnings to those ideologically opposed to them and their message. Drug cartels similarly filmed the torture and murder of rival gang members and their families and posted them online as a warning to others. The most shocking example came in March 2019 when a white supremacist carried out a mass shooting in Christchurch, New Zealand, killing 51 people in 2 mosques. The perpetrator carried a video camera and live-streamed his murderous rampage directly to Facebook, where it soon attracted hundreds of viewers who egged him on in real time. Viewers copied it and shared it to other social media platforms, including YouTube, LiveLeak, and Twitter. Despite efforts to contain it, the clip has been seen by millions of people. None of these pieces of internet footage are generally considered snuff. The 2 films that are the current closest to the snuff definition share similar names. I Lunatic, I Icepick depicts the murder and dismemberment of student June Lin by Luca Magnotta. That clip's name was an homage to one of the most notorious films to ever be uploaded to the internet outside the dark web. The 8-minute video, 3 Guys, 1 Hammer, is considered the litmus test for a viewer's stomach for gore. It has been downloaded and viewed millions of times. Most of those who watch it are in it for the shock value and never think too carefully about the story behind it. 3 Guys, 1 Hammer is the basis of the first story in this book, the story of the Dnepropetrovsk Maniacs, a pair of teens who went on an unthinkable, murderous rampage, which they filmed for the internet. Serial killers have entered into popular culture so firmly that specialty stores sell serial killer action figures, and serial killer tours take punters on morbid excursions to sites where acts of mayhem and torture were carried out. Despite their heinous crimes, some killers gain followers and supporters, with strangers writing to them in prison, offering to be pen pals, friends, and in some cases, to marry them. This is especially so when the killer exhibits a certain amount of charm, and their victims are seen as less sympathetic. The second story in this book, Killer Petey, is an extreme example of a serial killer who became a bona fide celebrity. Killer Petey was compared to fictional characters, the Punisher and Dexter, due to the perception that he was meting out justice to those who had wronged his family and to men who were guilty of heinous crimes. Indeed, Dexter has a lot to answer for. The perpetrator in the final story of this book was obsessed with a fictional murderer to the point of trying to follow in his footsteps. He is probably the only person in history to write a screenplay detailing every step of his commencement into the world of serial killing. According to Peter Vronsky in his book Serial Killers, The Method and Madness of Monsters, statistically speaking, identified serial killers usually turn out to be white males of above-average intelligence who begin killing in their 20s or 30s. None of the killers in this book fulfill the statistical profile in its entirety, but they all exhibit some of those characteristics. This book is by no means an exhaustive list of serial killers who have somehow used the internet in their crimes, but rather a deep dive into the crimes, motivations, and psychology of 3 of them. Part 1. 3 Guys, 1 Hammer. The Dnepropetrovsk Maniacs. A viral video. In December 2008, veteran journalist Caitlin Moran was surfing the web when she came across a link on a chat board. The person who posted it had written, "See if you can keep your breakfast down after watching this. I couldn't." Such comments are common in the internet age. We even have a term for them, clickbait. And so Ms. Moran clicked, expecting something along the lines of an unflattering gif of an obese person or a gross food challenge. Instead, Caitlin Moran found herself watching the beginning of 8 minutes of footage that have entered into internet folklore. The video, entitled 3 Guys, 1 Hammer, could be found on any of several sites with names like Rotten.com, SnuffX.com, and BestGore.com. These were the kinds of sites that encouraged members to scour the web and find the most graphic and disturbing images and films possible of murders, suicides, torture, mutilations, and accidents. The sites were competitive and tried to outdo each other with their depictions of real violence. They attracted millions of visitors, with the most graphic videos garnering hundreds of thousands of views and being shared widely among gore seekers. In Caitlin Moran's words, the link took us to some footage shot on a mobile phone in some bland, murky woodland. It appears to be early summer. 15 feet away, there's a man on the ground. It's immediately clear that a great many terrible things have happened to him quite recently, and that he will die very, very soon. She watched 1 minute and 47 seconds of the video before turning it off, knowing she could not stomach any more. However, that short amount of time was etched into her memory, a horror that would never leave her. Caitlin Moran wrote of the experience in The Times, UK. A large part of me was working on the hopeful premise that it was a very convincing drama project by some students, the kind of thing that was about to become a big viral hit, and about which the Daily Mail would become enjoyably enraged. Simultaneously, I was telling myself that it was probably a revenge attack, that this man had attacked a lover, killed a child, and although his murder was awful, in a world of almost infinite sorrow, it was not the unconscionably profane insult to humanity that it first appeared to be. I was using the thought of torturous retribution as a comfort. Neither hope was true. It was a real murder she had witnessed, and the story behind it was one of unimaginable horror. Hooligan acts. In 1988, in Dnepropetrovsk, the 4th largest city in Ukraine, 2 baby boys were born. First came Viktor Saenko on the 1st of March, and then less than 2 months later, on the 20th of April, Igor Saprunyuk entered the world. Dnepropetrovsk was an industrial town in a country in turmoil as it struggled to adapt to its independence following the collapse of the Soviet Union. But both Viktor and Igor were born into privilege, or at least comfortable middle class. Viktor's father was a computer engineer who worked with public prosecutions, and Igor's father was a pilot who spent several years ferrying around independent Ukraine's president, Leonid Kuchma. Both boys had mothers who doted on them. They wanted for nothing in a time when many of their countrymen were lining up at 6 a.m. for meager rations of work and paying for groceries with coupons given to them in lieu of wages. When Igor and Viktor met at school, each saw in the other a kindred spirit, and they became instant friends. Together with Viktor's lifelong friend, Alexander Hansa, they formed a trio that was soon doing everything together. The eldest of the boys by 2 weeks, Alexander did not have the wealth of his friends, living in a poorer part of town where it was said rats the size of dogs roamed the buildings. His father had died when he was a baby, leaving only his mother to provide for him. However, he had met Victor in kindergarten when such matters did not determine a friendship as much as shared interests in toys or the same color shoes. Still, he did not have the freedom or opportunities of the other two boys, and soon it was Igor and Victor who were the firm twosome, with Alexander tagging along when he could. The boys had an early brush with the law when they were caught throwing stones at moving trains. When police knocked on Victor's door and demanded compensation for the damage caused, the Sainkos paid up and grilled their son about the incident. Upon hearing that Igor was the instigator, they forbade Victor from seeing him. Victor did not listen because he was infatuated with the strange, charismatic Igor, and his parents didn't follow through on the prohibition. Typical of young boys, none of them liked attending school or doing their studies, but Igor and Victor had home computers, a rarity among their peers, and they spent many hours messing around on the internet. As they grew into teens, they got mobile phones and began to photograph and document everything they did, as teenagers so often do. Igor's mother had returned to her job as a high-ranking employee of the district state administration, and so he was left to entertain himself, unsupervised, a lot. During their time at the 96th Secondary School in Dnepropetrovsk, the three boys lived in fear of the older and stronger students who dominated the playground, meting out cruel punishments for any perceived weakness. Victor and Igor shared a fear of heights, and they were worried that this would attract the attention of the bullies and pay a harsh price for their feebleness. Having become accustomed to finding the answers to all their questions on the internet, Igor searched for advice on how to overcome acrophobia. One site recommended facing such fears head-on, and Igor convinced Victor to stand on a balcony of a 14th-floor apartment for hours, hanging over the railing and staring straight at the ground until eventually they stopped experiencing vertigo and their fear of heights subsided. They deemed the Face Your Fears method of getting over phobias a roaring success. Far from gaining empathy thanks to their own experience with bullies, Igor, Victor, and Alexander became increasingly aggressive and antisocial towards anyone they perceived as weaker than them, picking on younger, smaller boys. In 8th grade, Igor brutally beat another child and stole his bicycle, which he then gave to Victor. Although he drew the attention of police, he was not charged, and it was rumored that this was due to the intervention of his influential parents. Victor's parents again forbade him to be friends with Igor, but they did not supervise the boy or wonder where he was when he went out, so they continued to see each other. Later that year, Igor wound up in hospital after a glue-sniffing mishap. Also in 2002, a teacher complained that Igor and Alexander had committed what was described as hooligan acts against her. Rather than charges being brought, Igor was transferred to a neighboring school and Alexander was sent to a vocational school. Local residents would later tell reporters that during their time at school, the trio was terrifying the district, but nobody would notify the police because of the influence of Igor's parents, with his father seemingly able to make any unpleasant issue simply disappear. Ukraine never fulfilled early expectations that post-Soviet life would become an affluent free-market democracy, and the gap between the wealthy and the majority was marked. Whilst petty thieves stealing to feed their families were dealt with harshly by a corrupt legal system, it seemed that those with wealth and connections could get away with anything, perhaps even murder. Psychopaths in Training. Warning: this chapter contains descriptions of animal cruelty. Separating the three boys and sending them to separate schools did nothing to dampen the friendship. As the dominant member of the trio, Igor started to lead them into increasingly serious acts of vandalism and violence. He had developed a fondness for Adolf Hitler and would proudly tell everyone that he shared the Führer's birthday. He liked to take photos of himself with a drawn-on toothbrush mustache in front of one of the many swastikas he sprayed onto any surface he could find. Igor had considered the results of their experiment for beating the fear of heights a resounding success for he and Victor, so when Alexander admitted that he had a phobia of blood, Igor suggested using the same method to overcome this aversion. Alexander would have to get up close and personal with large amounts of blood in order to beat his fear. Igor suggested the best way to do this would be by slicing up living animals. There were many stray dogs in the forest area near Alexander's house, which they could capture and dismember, and so started a new era in the lives of the three teenagers. Capturing and slaughtering dogs and cats became a regular pastime. It did not take long before they moved on to torturing the animals before they died. Cats would be skinned alive. They hung dogs from trees and disemboweled them, allowing them to slowly bleed to death. Then Igor would use the blood to paint swastikas on the trees or fences nearby. They would take photographs of themselves posing with the carcasses, and soon the collection contained hundreds of pictures. They kept up this bloodthirsty sport long after Alexander overcame his squeamishness, and their actions became increasingly cruel. They believed that torturing animals would help them become tougher in adulthood. One day they fashioned a wooden cross that they hung in the garage of one of the boys. They nailed a white kitten to it, crucifixion style, filled the kitten's mouth with glue so that its screams would not be heard, then took it turns shooting at it with pistols loaded with rubber bullets. They filmed the little kitten's ordeal, laughing until it died. Meanwhile, the adults in their lives were seemingly oblivious to what the three teenagers were getting up to when they were not at school or home. Igor's parents led very busy lives with their high-powered jobs, and his father was away for long periods flying. Victor's father also spent a great deal of time at work, but his mother was at home. Perhaps she thought the blood on his clothes came from normal teenage shenanigans, or maybe he was adept at hiding the stains. Alexander's mother believed he was incapable of harming any living thing, and the boy was all she had, so she doted on him. Discipline and consequences for their actions did not feature in the lives of the teens. In 2005, when the trio were all around 17 years old, they set upon and beat up two 15-year-old boys. There is nothing in the history books to say why they chose those two targets, or if their attack was motivated by anything other than pure sadism. What the records do say is that the trio pounded the smaller boys in the face until they were a bloody mess. Their victims suffered from concussion, broken bones, and permanently disfigured faces. The parents of the 15-year-olds tried to bring charges against Igor, Victor, and Alexander, but once again, Igor's well-connected and influential father intervened. Using the fact that they were all under 18 as an excuse, the police decided not to lay the charges, much to the distress of the victims' families. The brutal trio got off with little more than a stern talking to by their parents. After graduating high school, Victor went to the Dnepropetrovsk Iron and Steel Academy part-time to study becoming a metallurgical technician and took on a job as a security guard. Neither of these things appealed to him nearly as much as playing around on the internet. He and Igor had discovered sites that allowed them to watch gore videos on the computer. They particularly liked the sites that had photos and videos of real murders.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?